Good morning, everyone. Today is a really good day. We invite Professor Ralph Woman from the University of Graz, Austria. He is our visiting scholar here, and this is the first day for the public talk. The topic is minority languages and standard languages. So may I introduce his special research a little bit? Professor Rab, he specializes in many areas of linguistics, such as sociolinguistic, multicultural, multilingualism, language contact, Hakka studies, Asian English and Creole. Another area like Sino-Tibetan studies, like Chinese, Hakka grammar, Tibetan grammar, Sino-Tibetan typology, and other area like methodology, like scientific empirical research method, and other syntax, case marker typology, verbal voice system, grammatical complexity. Okay, yes, please welcome Professor Rab. If to be good, if everyone who joined this talk today, please introduce a little bit yourself so we can know each other. And today is just like informal knowledge. Is that okay? Please introduce and yeah, ดำรงอาจารย์ดำรงได้ยินไหมอาจารย์ดำรงแนะนำตัวเองนิดหนึ่งได้ไหมคะเดี๋ยวคนอื่นตัก
โอเคสวัสดีครับอาจารย์ Good morning Mr. Ralph Moment
Good morning
Good morning I am Namrong. I am PhD student at University Mahidol University Linguistics program.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Okay, thank you. And other people, please introduce yourselves. Hello, please feel free.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I would like to apologize because I think there's a problem with my camera. That's why I can't open it right now. So my name is Jomar Tangonan from Rilka, taking multicultural studies. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I start speaking, and if you have questions, you can ask in between or after the talk, as you prefer. On this occasion, maybe you can tell about yourself a little bit. I hope you can understand my English. If not, please notify me. I will try to speak clearly. So the topic of today's talk is minority languages and standard languages. And my motivation for this talk is the observation that nowadays minority languages everywhere in the world seem to be used less and less. And I think one has to understand the situation, the reasons for that clearly. So I will start with a historical overview and then discuss the parameters which may lead to language abandonment. So first, I hope, wait a moment, I will put it in this size and I have worded it out so you can read what I'm speaking also. My historical introduction starts as follows. Imagine olden times without writing. And at that time, where did I put this? At that time, language was basically needed for communication in some group. And sooner or later, some group will have contact with other groups who may speak another language. That means that people, usually adults, have to learn another language. That's why we distinguish first language acquisition and second language acquisition. In L2 acquisition, typically the first language influences the second. So if L1 and L2 have different grammar, usually the speakers of L1 copy their grammatical patterns on L2 when speaking. If this becomes more habitual in the society, then the grammar may change. This is called convergence, and this leads to areal types. So to give an example, the languages of northern India, the Himalayas, and Tibet share many grammatical characteristics. This is an areal type, although the languages are not historically related. Language change does not only describe the natural drift of historical changes within one language group, but it also is influenced by language contact. And sometimes it is very difficult to discern what is a historical origin and what is an intermediary influence from another language. And since language changes all the time, especially under conditions of language contact. So I tried to make a kind of diagram where there is a language A, which splits up in language A1 and A2. And A1, it changes a little, but it remains the same because it is quite isolated. A2, on the other hand, interacts with the language B1 and they become closer. And eventually the speaker of A2 may give up their language and speak the language B1. The B1 may later again diverge in two different languages or two dialects. So this is how it happens. As you can see in B2, I imagined one imperial language which covers other languages, and C1 is no longer used, as you can see, and so on. So there are many mutual influences and language change and language shift. So when people change the language they're using, happens all the time in history. This is a rather natural state of affairs. Grammatical convergence is defined as the increase in similarities between two languages at any level based on pattern transfer. And this happens in language contact. Oh yes, other areal types. I mentioned the Himalayan area. are the Balkan or Southeastern Europe, which is the first well-described areal type of languages. And another one would be Central European. In other words, German, French, English, Italian are not very different from each other, irrespective of historical relationships. They just were used a lot by the same speakers. So this has been called Standard Average European by Worf, or Eurotype in a later approach. So most of the time in the world, people are multilingual speakers of several languages. And let me call this horizontal multilingualism, because all these languages are, ideally speaking, equal. And no language dominates another one. And how can they coexist? By being functionally distinct. This is the situation of diglossia, where people use different languages for different communicative tasks. And we can assume these languages have equal prestige. For example, in Malaysia, we have the situation of speakers of Cantonese, Hakka, Hokkien, Taishan, Teochew, and other groups. And they are not at first mutually intelligible, but people usually have one family language and learn the others to some degree in order to do business and so on. So this is a natural situation between spoken languages. Then, of course, sooner or later, one of the languages typically becomes relatively more widespread or more used than others. And this leads to the development of a so-called lingua franca. There are special cases, for instance, societies with exogamy. That means the spouse, typically the woman, has to come from another tribe. What does that mean for the languages? The children learn their first language, the tribal language, always from a non-native speaker. This has immediate effects on the grammars, which are all very similar and are all isolating in the Brazilian rainforest, for example. So we find here morphological simplification and a high degree of convergence of grammatical categories. Nonetheless, all the languages survive inside of their own tribe. This leads us to this side effect. Morphological simplification seems to be a sign of high amount of language contact. If you have many non-native speakers, then complex morphological systems tend to break down. Morphological complexification, on the other hand, seems to happen mostly in isolated communities, which are given enough time to develop such systems. So it comes as no surprise that, for instance, English is relatively simpler in terms of morphology than, for instance, German. It has experienced more language contact and it has moved more. Now, the next thing that happened after lingua franca, which is used for wider communication, is the development of empires. And in an empire, there seems to be one dominating language of the ruling class. An empire may start out in cruel ways by conquest and so on, but it provides after a while political stability across cultures, and that is a requirement for multilingualism and lingua franca. It is very interesting to find that, for instance, Latin, the language of the Roman Empire 2000 years ago, was not that widespread while the empire was in place, but the language became more important after the empire has ended and the old order had broken down, because then Latin was still the common denominator for people to communicate, and the classical written language remained a useful resource for administration, for the new religion, Christianity, for history, and for knowledge. It was, however, known and used mostly by the clergy, by the religious people, who were the specialists for writing. And that's why the Christian Church helped organize at that time, wild societies of Europe, reorganized after the Roman Empire, and established monasteries which kept the records in written form. So we can read in Hobsbawm, 1996, as long as people lived in such an oral universe where people only speak but don't write, a written language is the topic for a minority, for very few people. And in this situation, the written language probably does not influence too much any of the spoken languages. It was actually very unusual in the Middle Ages for a non-cleric to be able to read and write. But when they did so, at this moment, they often tried to write their own language and not Latin. So we find in the 13th century, a knight wrote a poem or a book, and it starts with these words. A knight was so educated that he even could read books, and he read everything he found written. He was called Hartmann. Yeah. And so these are first attempts to write an unwritten language with the letters which came from the Latin language. And this is the beginning, if you like, of the German language. But at that time, it was not unified. So Hartmann was from Alemannic area, and Walter, the second example, that is a Bavarian. He speaks like Austrians do, or people in Munich. And these two would have had some difficulty communicating at times. And they are still close. There were more different dialects as well. So, as we can see, immediately arises the need for standardization of language so that one can be understood across wider territories. And so, for instance, Hartmann seems to have avoided words which would not have been understood by Bavarian readers or listeners. So we can see here that he already attempts to get closer to speakers of another language. And when we look at the empire, the Roman Empire, once again, it started out as a small city-state under the heavy influence of the Etruscans, who lived here. And the Etruscans themselves, they were heavily influenced by the Greek culture which existed in southern Italy at that time. Here are the Phoenicians. And so the Etruscans knew Greek, and the Romans learned Etruscan for quite some time. They could speak Etruscan language. And later, they switched over to learning Greek as the language of education. And for a long time in the Roman Empire, first Etruscan, then Greek, were actually the highest prestige languages. Only after a while, Latin started to dominate. But then the Roman Empire became too large, and they decided to split it into two pieces, and they founded Constantinople as a second capital. And we can see here a language map. It was in the middle of the Greek-speaking world. So here people spoke Latin mostly, and here they spoke Greek. And in other parts of the empire, they spoke even other languages. So now we find a multilingualism at the upper class level of society between written classical languages. This doesn't necessarily tell us what the people were really speaking. The most languages in the empire were simply not documented, and the Romans did not speak classical Latin, but they spoke a form called Vulgar Latin, which had a quite different grammar from classical Latin. And it is this language which then became dominant after the end of the empire, and which developed into what we know today as the Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, French, but also, let's not forget, Romanian. The educated language, as I said, was not known by most people. So it is not classical Latin which influenced the normal people. It was vulgar Latin or spoken Latin. I looked for an example. So this would be Latin with a lot of grammar, a lot of morphology. Suos, obsides, quos casso, that is sent. And Italian, the same phrase would be lius dati, which is this word, a different word. Che has become more simple grammatically. Avevano dato, so an analytic verb form which replaces this verb, and a preposition instead of case marking in Latin. So you see, the language seems to have changed a lot, but actually it didn't change in this way. It changed from spoken Latin into Italian, and then the difference is not so big anymore. So I want to emphasize the Romans in the Roman Empire did not have any language policy. I mean, they were rude people. They killed people and so on. But it was not about language. And Latin was all the time a minority language because it was the language of a tiny ruling class. And this ruling class themselves, they were bilingual. They could speak Greek, for instance. So we can see that a written language is a very different type of language from the spoken languages, but it is a very valuable written resource for the use of a large state. I think an empire absolutely needs writing, otherwise it wouldn't be able to administrate the area. And the writers are experts, scribes, and one usually has to learn for a long time to become a scribe. That is a difficult task. And because this written language is a valuable resource, it was readily taken up by the invaders of the empire, the Germanic tribes who took over after the end of the West Roman Empire, and they kept the monks to write in Latin language. Very similarly, we do not know where Chinese is really coming from, but one agrees that it must be some kind of Tibetic language in the beginning. We don't know what the Shan dynasty has spoken. We know today that they've started writing, that's for sure. Then the Zhou dynasty took over, and the Zhou, they seem to have been a Tibetic people, not Tibetan, but Tibetic, so similar to Tibet. And most probably it was their language which spread out as a lingua franca or imperial language to people who spoke any other type of languages. And so we might have had a situation of creolization, so the very quick acquisition of the language of the Zhou, and that may explain why Chinese is so different from the other Tibeto-Burman languages on the one hand, and also morphologically completely changed from this Tibeto-Burman model. So it might have experienced a lot of convergence with local languages which have vanished and which we do not know anymore. We can assume that perhaps the speakers also in central China spoke Austronesian, Tai-Kadai, maybe some completely unknown languages. And we find minority languages inside of China mostly at the margins when viewed from an economic and political center. So in the north and the east of China, people speak Chinese, and the more you go to the southwest, the more you will find other languages. Just to give you an insight, this is a Qiangic language somewhere in Sichuan province. And you can see the Tibeto-Burman languages used to be quite complex. And now compare that with today's Chinese, which is completely isolating. Okay. Now, these classical written languages are actually of restricted usability because only experts, scribes, can use them. So the modernization of the written language is the next important step, and that's what I mean by standard languages. I will come back to that in a moment. So in the olden empires, we have imperial languages, which are so-called classical written languages, where the written language is not very close with the spoken practices of the people. And I think there weren't any language policies except for informal ones, like you better learn Latin if you don't want to run into troubles with the Romans. But there was not an explicit policy for that. And therefore, there were no linguistic conflicts. Everybody simply tried to speak the language necessary for a task. At that time, if illiterates wanted to send a letter, let's say, they had to ask a scribe to write it, then the letter was sent, and then a scribe had to read it to the receiver, because the people themselves could not read and write. And all during those times, Latin was used irrespective of what the people were speaking. So we find one document from 842 where a historian describes historical events in Latin language, but then gives the literal words of what these two kings were saying. And we find here first the Latin historian's text, and then the quotation where this person suddenly says, pro Deo amor et pro Christian popolo et nostro commun salvament. And what we find here is vulgar Latin or Old French. And later, again, a Latin text, and then a literal quote in Gottes Minna in des Christianes Volkes, and so on. This is Old Alemannic German. So we see there is a need for the scribe to use these uncodified languages, because it is very important to get the literal expression of these two kings. And this leads to an increasing urge to be able to write these other languages too. I tried to exemplify here also the language change, pro Dei amorem, that would be classical Latin with a lot of morphology. But these old French people, they said pro Deo amor, they had two cases, one case marker. And so this is like the love of God. And modern French is again different. It sounds like pour l'amour de Dieu. Now the case marking is also gone completely. So this was the classical language. This is an basically undocumented spoken language. And much later, the people who are now known as French codified a new standard language, which is vaguely related to the old language. So this brings us to the development of modern written and spoken standard languages. Everything I said until here is classical written-only languages. It doesn't even matter how to pronounce it because it is just used in written form anyway. Writing requires standardization, and then there was a social change. The towns grew bigger, and the townspeople, they did business, and they became rich, and they became an economic competition to the aristocracy. And for their job as business people, bank people, and so on, they needed a written language, but they had no time to learn Latin. And so increasingly, they got contracts in Latin language and asked the scribe to write below the Latin text in their local language what the Latin text actually means. And so very much in the image of Latin, for instance, the German language slowly emerged. So when finally the French Revolution took place and brought a series of very new ideals of equality and so on between all people, and the formation of a republic and later of a so-called nation state, there was suddenly a need for a spoken and written language which could be shared by all citizens. And for that reason, the idea of general education emerged. Everybody should go to school and learn at least to read and write. And what? Of course, one codified language, which was soon called a national language. So that's why the modern languages emerged and slowly replaced the Latin language in Europe. In China, a similar process took place in every place in the world, of course. The classical Chinese was too traditional. And so since the 19th century, there were efforts to create a more modern type of standardized Chinese. And in 1956, in China, the Putonghua was officially pronounced. And this move always turns out to be very successful for the population, in this case, even for overseas Chinese, who rather quickly adopted this new communicative resource. The same happened in Europe with the respective national languages, which gave the population of entire states one standardized way of communicating. And once you do that, of course, now is the moment that you see the emergence of minority languages and dialects. Minority languages are languages which are different from this standard language, and dialects are sufficiently similar to be called just a spoken version of this standard language. So the minority languages were earlier not recognized, but also not problematic. And now suddenly they appear like an obstacle in a plan, because the state wants everybody to speak the same language. So what do I mean by standard language? First of all, it must become de-ritualized. Classical languages such as Tibetan or classical Chinese or Latin are very often used in very ritualistic form. So even if people learn to read them, they yet are not able to write. And they are not used for other purposes. So they are special purpose languages. Now, de-ritualization is the process where a written language is no longer bound to such functions and can be used for every kind of communication. The next point is demotization. Classical languages are often quite complex. The writing system is difficult and so on. And it takes too much time for normal people to learn that system. So sooner or later, this language becomes demotized. So it is approached more to the standard, to the spoken usage of the language in the country. We can see in olden times and today that the use of classical written practices holds societies back. For example, sticking to classical Arabic in many Arabic countries is a problem. And they also shift slowly but steadily to local modern varieties, to use them in written and spoken form. A third point is activation. That means that less specialized users of the written language can use the written language in a less terse, less formulaic, less polite more colloquial way. Imagine writing an email or an SMS that is much less formulaic than, for instance, letters written in the 17th century. So these are the parameters of a modern standard language: de-ritualized, demotized, activated. And then there is another important point. They are elaborated. So they actually get new registers, high registers of use. I will come back on that later. I give you an example. In the 13th century, the Emperor King Frederick wrote a book. And of course, he wrote this book in classical Latin. That was the only language. I was just looking for the chat. The only language available for writing. And the other extreme below is a research paper written in Tok Pisin, a Creole language from Papua New Guinea, based on English. Yeah. So the first title is De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, and the second title is One Bella Tetapes Long Tok Pisin Belong Baim Ticket Belong Palus. You can read the translation. So we can see that in B, even a Creole language can be elaborated to research purpose. Elaboration brings new complex structures to a language. In German, we can see very clearly it was hard to write German until approximately the 17th century, and then the language literally exploded, got very complex structures, and then came a classical period in the 18th century with philosophy and literature flourishing in German language. Standardization also helps to bring new ideas, let's say, into a language. So if there are completely new concepts in society, they can be transported by planned languages. And so, for instance, here we see a quotation from a Tibetan dictionary from communist East Germany, where they said they had to adapt the Tibetan language to the new needs. And so this is the modernization of the Tibetan language, and this could only happen in the spoken language and not in the old classical language. So sooner or later, this requirement reaches all societies that there is a modern standard language having these features. But this also has the side effect of the politicization of language. Now suddenly language is also a political problem or question. And people who say they want a certain language to be used often have a political background of some kind. Now, general education had the task to bring the standard language to the people who formerly did not speak the standard language. And so it turns out quite quickly that the teachers were discriminating and were hostile to the non-standard varieties and stigmatized the speakers as uneducated, unsophisticated, rural, and backward. I'm sure many even of the listeners may have experienced schools where it was forbidden to use a smaller language. So these are the negative side effects of a standard language in a country. The idea of the nation state, as I said, however, comes from the need to to make everybody in the country participate in the public discourse. So the original case for a standard language was not aggressive towards other languages. It was a democratic tool. One might ask, how could citizens understand each other or participate in the discourse if their government is conducted in an incomprehensible language? So that was the original motivation of national languages. And that's why they viewed minority languages and dialects as a problem. Standard languages can be introduced even when they themselves are virtually unknown. Taiwan was inhabited by a majority of Hokkien and Hakka speaking people and Austronesians. And when the Japanese took the island, they Japanized the population. And people switched over to speaking Japanese at home. And when the Republic of China was founded by the Kuomintang, they had a policy of Sinicization. They didn't want to speak people. They didn't want people to speak Hokkien and Hakka either. And only much later, the policies changed again, and Hokkien and Hakka is now some of the national languages of Taiwan. Indonesian, which is basically a form of Malay, was spoken by 2.5% of the Indonesian population as their mother tongue, but it was a well-known lingua franca. And it seems that majority of the population readily agreed to make this the national language of Indonesia when the country needed a national language. And so you could say the same for any other language. Italian, for instance, is largely a planned language which has been defined by some linguistic academy. And quite successfully replaced many of the dialects of Italian. So you see, we are coming slowly to the more problematic sides of language policies, because demanding an ideal state speaking only one language, that has led to rather nasty developments in the past already, and could happen again, where minorities are heavily discriminated, and language being one of the markers of being a minority. It is, of course, unrealistic to assume that any country would be completely monolingual. But then there is another development, which is the emergence of global languages. When the Europeans built ships and had better weapons and conquered many places in the world, their already developed standard languages traveled with them. They were not imposed on people. Often it was the opposite. They didn't want the conquered people to learn these languages, but they were ready-made valuable resources for administration and so on. And again, when the colonial powers withdrew, mostly after Second World War, after decolonization, these languages became even more important in many parts of the world. So Spanish became more important in Latin America after the Spanish lost the power over the area, and English became very important after independence in India and also Malaysia, because it was a non-ethnic shared lingua franca for the people. And it was already fully elaborated and activated and demotized, something which was not the fact for many other languages. So it is not an aggressive act to bring these languages to other places, but it is an elaborated resource which is readily usable. Whereas, for instance, Malay or Hindi, first of all, struggled to develop such a register of a standard language, and second, also created ethnic tensions with people who did not accept to be dominated, for instance, by the Hindi-speaking people, for instance, the Tamils in India. So that's why English remained in place, so in order to avoid conflicts. In Malaysia, the situation gets even a little bit more complicated. First, Malay was introduced as the only national language. English has been termed an official language after a while, and the ethnic Chinese in Malaysia are not only quite happy to know English, but also often attempt to learn standard Chinese. And if you ask why, it's mostly because for utilitaristic reasons, because they are globally relevant. So they focus on the communicative usability of languages. How did things happen in Europe? First, the nation states frowned upon linguistic diversity from below, so they were very much against minority languages and suppressed them. And suddenly now, in modern times, they see a threat from above, from English, because 90% of all students in Europe now learn English. You can go around everywhere in Europe and speak English nowadays. So even large, well-established languages such as French or German are today spoken by bilingual populations. And this is even more true for the smaller languages such as Dutch or Danish. The EU, on the other hand, has a policy that all national languages of all member states are completely equal and everything needs to be translated in every other language. However, how does this work out in practice? De Swan, a sociologist, concluded the more multilingualism in EU, the more English. In practice, EU uses English. It is not the case that not everybody would know English. So why do we need a translation into German and Polish and Lithuanian and Hungarian and so on? This is already a symbolic use of language. And that means it is like showing your political stand. You don't want to be ignored. The EU also pursues language policies of autonomous regions instead of states. So in a way, they dissolve the nation states and favor very much autonomous regions, usually with some minority languages. And in this case, signboards and laws need to be translated into minority languages. So this creates, of course, a written multilingualism, which, however, is by and large quite artificial because the languages are not used as much as it appears to be the case. For example, in Ireland, for maintaining their Irish identity, everybody has to learn Irish very thoroughly at school. And every signboard in the country is in Gaelic and English. And everybody speaks English all day long. We could go to the former Soviet Union and see a similar situation. Nations such as Kazakhstan would like now to have their own national language, Kazakh, which is a kind of Turkish, but it is not yet elaborated enough. And so Russian is still in use. And they have to undertake the work of a linguistic academy to elaborate Kazakh. At the same time, this doesn't feel like making much sense because every Kazakh speaker and a good deal of the population in Kazakhstan are Russians anyway. Everybody knows Russian right away. So here we see the clash between communicative necessity and a political interest in using a certain language. In Pakistan, people may slightly protest against Urdu being the national language because, to begin with, 60% of the population speak a variety of Punjabi, and many minorities are also not interested in Urdu but stick to their own language. And educated people speak English with their children. So we see here that global languages and readily available elaborated languages have a natural tendency to dominate in practical life any smaller language and even smaller national languages. For English, Kachru has described the inner, outer, and expanding circle. The expanding circle are all the countries where English is only a lingua franca used by non-native speakers. And this expanding circle becomes bigger and bigger over time. In many countries, if not in almost all countries of the world, speaking English is very important. In the corporate world, it has become a normality, for instance, in Austria, to speak English because of the international workforce. And so even large languages such as German or French are, if you like, under threat. So the most efficient communicative resource will prevail. And in a global world, one could say one language would be most useful. This idea came up in the 19th century when some people, such as Mr. Zamenhof, developed international languages. You may have heard of Esperanto, which is the language founded by Zamenhof. Well, they did not succeed, but you see the idea. This is the opposite of small language preservation. Of course, English experiences localizations. So, for instance, Malaysian English, Singaporean English, or Indian English develop their own special ways, and you might consider them new dialects because they appear due to geographical distance. And English is, of course, at the same time taken out of the hands of the native speakers in America and England and Australia and so on. And it becomes a globally shared resource. What actually do we mean by elaboration? I think we should dwell on this for a moment. If you speak in basilectal level, so you are usually in a dialogue between you and a communication partner, speaking about the third person or about the situation you are in. So you can use very simple structures. You can say, you're tired, you go home to sleep. On the other hand, if you give a speech or you write an article, then you speak to unknown listeners, and you must make sure that you provide all the background for what you are saying. And then also, usually you have time to formulate, and so you can densify the information. And then you may come up with, when it is late, one should return home to have some rest, a general statement. You see, A and B are the same language, but these are two different registers of the language. One is a highly context-dependent dialogical way of speaking, where a lot of the meaning can be derived by implication and inference. In the second type of speaking or reading or writing, you have junctors, a more complex structure, a more generalized context, and you provide explicit relations through junctors and so on. So this is basically elaboration. While every language in the world surely has level A, not necessarily is it possible easily to use the level B in every language. So this is what is meant by elaboration. In olden times, elaboration happened when there were political speakers in Rome or in Greece. They needed to speak convincingly to the population. And population is a mass of listeners, and they must be provided with all pro and contra argumentation and the conclusion in which direction the speaker wants them to think. So this is a very different way of communication. We could say it is context independent. You can write a book and everybody can read it anytime later. And it is more concise and more explicit. So, because this is not exactly the difference between speaking and writing, we don't say oral and literal or something. We say orate, so like speaking, and literate. It is more like writing. And basically, these are high and low registers of a language. Sometimes it has been called high and low, as you may know. So every language which gets standardized inevitably also must be elaborated. It receives this new register, which departs from the written form, but can also be used in spoken form. So it is, as I said before, an activated language. A lack of elaboration is the reason why smaller languages lack this register and then often appear impolite or rude or simple to speakers of an elaborated language, which of course helps the stereotype and the possible discrimination of a language. And whenever one tries to promote a language, the first thing that will happen is to elaborate it. But how can you elaborate the language? Now, in history, let me give you a different example. In the Hittite Empire, thousands of years ago, the Hittite Empire existed for 1,000 years. And for 800 years, they wrote the Sumerian language, which was already available. And only in the end of the empire, they had developed Hittite to the degree that they could use it as their standard language. So everywhere in history, you see the same development. First, you need to standardize a modern linguistic resource, then only you can use it. And where do you get elaboration from? From an earlier example. So the Romans used Etruscan and Greek, the Hittites used Sumerian, the French and the Germans used Latin, and so on. So elaboration always also means a huge amount of convergence of language influence from a previous elaborated system. And that, of course, is an important point when we speak about preservation of small languages. When you standardize a small language, it also changes its character. And typically, it gets heavily influenced or even more influenced by the dominating language, which serves as a role model for elaboration and standardization. And so, when one actually standardizes a small language, the question is, how much does one actually change it in the process? So now we can classify our different types of languages. A language, we can say, refers to usually to a standardized variety. This is recognized by the people as a language. You know, when you ask people, what language do you speak? They may say German. They don't say Upper Styrian dialect of Bavarian. They say German. And this is typically the national language. A dialect is sufficiently similar, non-standard variety of a standard language. A sociolect is similar to the standard language, but somehow stigmatized, belonging to a specific group. In cities, often there is a linguistic difference between poorer people and very rich people, and these are sociolects. And then nowadays, because there is so much ethnic mixing in most countries of the world, what may develop are ethnolects, which is a sociolect bound to a certain ethnic group. And finally, we define minority languages if they do not have their own nation and are not similar to the dominant national standard language of the country where they are living, where the speakers are living. This all leads us to this concept Ausbau and Abstand, these are German words. Ausbau is elaboration, Abstand is distance, introduced by Heinz Kloss, a famous German linguist who worked a lot on America. USA was a favorite topic of his because there many languages from Europe came together and ended up being English speakers mostly. No? He coined a lot of terminology for minority language research. And he says a standard language is like a roof over all the dialects and all the minority languages inside of a state. And by roof, he means also they influence these languages. And if people speak a so-called dialect, that is an Ausbau or elaboratable language, which means it is gradually approached to the standard language. It becomes more and more similar. And an Abstand language, a distanced language, is a minority language. It cannot simply be digested by the standard language. And so it remains a separate entity, but it is equally heavily influenced by the roofing language. And so now we have an asymmetrical or vertical multilingualism. In the beginning, I said horizontal. Now I say a vertical multilingualism because one language dominates all the others, and the other languages cannot easily influence the dominant language. So now there is no more equality, and the difference between the languages is one of register variation. Languages will still persist as long as there is a functional separation, diglossia, between them. However, if the languages are used for the same purpose, diglossia breaks down, and the speakers in practice usually switch to the dominant language. So the dialects and minority languages, they may or may not influence each other. At least in historical times they did this. But today we have this situation, the standard language roofing over all the other languages, and eventually taking more and more functional domains from the smaller languages, so that in the end everybody just speaks the standard language. So far we have mostly mentioned minority languages of the land, but in modern migrational movements in the 20th century and ongoing, many different groups are living in the same urban areas everywhere in the world. And this has been called superdiversity, superdiverse societies, where you find 100 languages in one city. And again, it is the first thing that happens is heavy local influence of a language. To give an exotic example, an urban speaker of some Papuan language who lives in Port Moresby uses Tok-Pisin words quite heavily in his way of speaking his own language, whereas the rural speaker uses the traditional words. So this is, of course, step one. And step two might be language shift. The speaker may give up speaking his language and speaks only Tok-Pisin, because most of the time he meets speakers who use Tok-Pisin, but not this language. I don't think I have enough time to go into that. And maybe very shortly. In Austria, people mostly speak German. There are minority languages, etc., but most people speak German. And they speak dialect. So they might say, I have just one example sentence, was hast gesagt? And in standard language, you would say, was hast du gesagt? In phonetics. Yeah. And now look what the upper class people would do. They would say, was hast du gesagt? And if you compare, then you see it is a little bit in between. So there's not the full O here, but also not the A of the language, of the standard language. So it is half dialectal. And the modern younger people, they say something completely different. They say, was hast gesagt? And now you see they choose different phonological features to produce their urban language. And now it is no longer just a question between dialect and standard language, but we have here different sociolects which use the phonology, the available phonology, in different ways. Now, we undertook it over many years to list all the differences that there are. So what is in standard language, an E is typically an ear in dialect, and so on, all these differences. And they are not all the same in their evaluation by the speakers. And so people will use them in different variations. I give you one example. The standard word for bridge in German is Brücke. In Austrian dialect, it would be Brücken. And now look, the same speaker in a YouTube video, he says in 1 or 2 minutes, hinter der Straßenbrücke, this is dialect, but this is standard language. Stabilisierung von dem Brückenfundament, this is dialect. Well, this doesn't have a dialect form. Diese is standard Brücken. So he mixes the morphology of the standard language with the dialect phonology of the next word. And then he says, Eisenbahnbrücke is completely standard. Yeah. So this is from a very short recording on short video on YouTube, and how he uses the word Brücke or Brücken. And he constantly goes back and forth between these. So you cannot say he's speaking dialect, and he doesn't speak standard language either. He chooses from a phonological repertoire to create a certain socio-pragmatic effect. That's what's happening to dialects. They are roofed over by the standard language, and then they are incorporated as pragmatic variation. Maybe because it's funny, I show you this one. This one is shorter. A person called the police, this is forensic data, and he says, "Alles weiß ich, alles weiß ich," a Viennese speaker. This is completely dialect, and this is the same sentence in standard German. Why does he repeat his sentence in standard German a second time? Because the socio-pragmatic function of the standard language is, among other things, emphasis, seriousness. So it improves the credibility, so to say, of what he's saying. And on the other hand, minority languages, they are heavily influenced by the standard language as well. I won't read the example now for you. This is Slovene in Austria. But when I say Slovene, you know there is a country, Slovenia, and they have their own standard Slovene language. But this language, of course, is not well known in Carinthia in Austria. But now the children go to school and learn standard Slovene at school as their minority language. And that basically means that they have some amount of trouble talking to their grandmother, because their grandmother doesn't know standard Slovene. She only speaks a Slovene dialect, and a dialect which is influenced by German. So for a cross-border minority, for instance, it is not that easy to maintain the language, because what should it do? Switch to a foreign standard? Develop their own standard? Standardization is a problem for a small, non-national group of people. Only a nation, a state, can easily organize language use like that. And in Europe, there are many cross-border minorities, and they all face such problems. On the other hand, I don't read that. Let's speak about Hakka in Taiwan. Hakka is a national language in Taiwan, but actually it's a minority language. It is spoken by approximately or let's say 13.4% of the population are Hakkas in Taiwan. It is known that Hakka is given up by its speakers more readily than Hokkien language. And when we interviewed speakers in Taiwan, first of all, they often switched to Chinese. So they were not used anymore speaking Hakka. And second, many expressions they produced were always exact copies of standard Chinese. So we can conclude that Hakka has really become a dialect of Guoyu because it is so completely dominated by the competence in Chinese. And in very many cases, the same sentence would be produced quite differently in other places. So here we see the language is similar enough to the dominating language to get heavily influenced and finally approach the standard language. Then we also looked at online available recordings. And now this is one of our interviews where the speaker constantly switches back and forth with a pragmatic effect between Hakka and Guoyu. And so you can see a very creative use, but this is similar, comparable to how dialect functions today in Austria. Also here, yeah, maybe the difference is not bigger. And then we looked on YouTube videos from Hakka TV, and we found that very often the people switched also back and forth between Hakka and standard Chinese. So actually, our task in linguistics might be to develop this socio-phonological approach, which we were using for European languages already, for such situations where Hakka and Chinese, for instance, begin to merge into one, and thereby, of course, produce certain socio-pragmatic effects. Now, the political aspect of minority languages. As I said before, here's a quote from a French politician post-World War II, Pompidou. "There is no place for minority languages in a France destined to make its mark on Europe." Now, nobody today agrees with such a statement, but that was the language policy for a long time in many countries of the world. And in Europe, France is quite a leading state in this respect. So these were clearly anti-minority statements. Speaking Breton language in France was forbidden in public spaces, at schools and so on. And that may or may not have contributed to the decline of these languages, but what it certainly did was create a counter movement, people who were advocating for the minority languages. So the emergence of minority language activists. And this very often then became linked with political or even ideological interests, and started to be a kind of battle against the main society. So just one example among many in many places. Here we see the German town name, Klagenfurt, in Austria, and somebody wrote Celovec on top, which is the Slovene word for this town. Yeah, and this is the so-called town sign dispute, and I saw very similar activities in France and so on at the time when the minorities were actually not, usually not cherished. Today, such things, I think, do no longer occur, or only very rarely, when there is a dispute about the number of speakers in some village. But this is the language, the fight for languages. And of course, we must be aware, it's not the case that Slovene speakers don't find the town when they read Klagenfurt. It is a symbolic act. They do not want to read this. They want to read that. And the other way around as well. So it is a political attitude, a symbolic use of the language. For something to be a language and to be fought for, first, there needs to be an identity. Actually, many groups of people, at least in the past, weren't particularly aware of being a minority. You can see this in language names, when in the Zare in northern Italy, linguist Tennyson asked the people which languages they spoke. They said, well, Friuli and Italian and our language. They didn't have a name for their language. And Wutun in China is quite similar. When they are asked what language do you speak, they say Ngandehua, which seems to translate as our language. So speakers are not necessarily clearly aware that they are speaking a special language. And very often, the speakers of minority languages do not feel any need for activism for the language. They have a purely communicative and practical approach. They speak languages in their functional domain. So there is a difference between language activism and language use. Many minority language speakers even do not support revitalization efforts. For instance, they express that they want to learn that people shall learn the national language or the global language, English. I think this hasn't been taken into account enough in the recent past research in linguistics. So, as I said, of course, earlier discrimination stimulated this counter-reaction, especially in what is today called social justice, where people like to portray themselves in some kind of victim category, demanding privileges or affirmative action. And this went so far in some publications as to speak of linguicide and linguistic genocide, or linguicism, which is a word like racism, and the demand for linguistic human rights. I'm not comfortable with such wording because I think we should preserve such murderous vocabulary and such terrible things to where it really is a big concern, and not use it for the fact that a language is spoken less or no longer spoken. That is not yet murder and discrimination. So I'm not happy with this type of description. Actually, this is an emotional approach to a sociological phenomenon, and I think we should simply analyze the sociological phenomenon. And it has been criticized by sociologists. For instance, when you look at this wording, linguistic sentimentalism, speaking about linguists, or here another sociologist, the cult of minority languages. So it shouldn't be emotionalized. And very often it is really a symbolic act. For instance, Catalan language, and you may remember they tried to segregate from Spain a few years ago, or some politicians tried to do that. But look, if you compare Catalan, Spanish, and Occitan in southern France, they always say Catalunya, Catalunya, Catalunya. They just write it differently. So is this a battle over orthographies? I know the language Catalan is different from standard Spanish. But then is it so much different that it really needs to have its own country? Maybe this all derives from the fact that Catalonia used to be an independent kingdom, then became part of Spain, but this old identity of theirs didn't die. And that's why they feel like they are not Spanish. But who has an advantage from such increasing segregation? The Scottish trying to become independent, the Catalans and many other places might follow. On the opposite are linguistic schisms, where people speaking virtually the same language, but cannot get along with each other for cultural reasons, and therefore state that these are different languages. It is not a quarrel, but the same is true for Bulgarian, Macedonian. They understand each other perfectly. And Hindi and Urdu, of course, is based on different ideologies behind these languages. We should also understand that pro-minority movements were originally always very conservative, documenting a traditional state of affairs. And then it became somewhat a left agenda, and including ecology. And there's even a direction in linguistics called eco-linguistics, speaking about exactly this problem. And we get an identity politics approach where everybody needs to belong to a small group, also linguistically, among all the other things. And one is oppressed and must fight against some higher power. This is a complete reinterpretation of what the standard language really is. And it somehow goes completely against the practical use of languages. So now UNESCO and all states in the world go with affirmative action for small languages and support and finance textbooks and school activities and so on in minority languages. But if you think about it, the school should prepare children for being able to do business, earn money, advance society when they are grown up. This happens with a global language, with a national language, and this does not happen with a small language. It's just a lot of energy which doesn't translate into communicative usefulness. So, and it wouldn't be a problem. Why not support all languages? But support very quickly turns into a negative attitude, at least in Europe, I can say, where a dominating language is actually attacked. And this happens in a situation where everybody knows the standard languages, and almost nobody speaks the small languages, but it is presented in the reverse way. So as much as I love all the small languages, you know, Breton and all the languages I tried to learn, but that is not a useful approach to them, in my view. This has been uttered by historian Hobsbawm. Politics and not culture is at the core of this language manipulation. He spoke about the smaller national languages in Europe, but this equally applies today to the non-national minority languages. He mentions the Catalan nationalism, is directed against Spain. So actually it is a negative movement and not a positive movement. It doesn't add anything, but it wants to subtract something. And this is not useful. because the children in the minority area still need to know the standard language, that's for sure. Sociologist de Swan went even further, analyzing the language policies of the European Union, who celebrate linguistic diversity. And he asks the rhetorical question, what does that mean? Does that mean that the Irish study now Latvian, and the Cypriots study Hungarian, and the Czechs study Finnish, and that helps them to communicate? This rhetorical question immediately makes clear why English is successful everywhere, why we speak English here, because it wouldn't help if I learn Breton and then come to Thailand. So it only helps that I know English. Everything else, for instance, learning Hakka, that's fun, but it is not, it doesn't add anything to my communicative abilities in the world. So we could say that there are two interests, obviously. One is this desire to preserve some old culture, language, and so on. And the other side is the very sober, secular idea, is it communicatively useful? And the answer in today's situation for most minority languages is basically no. So this is the ethical or moral question behind the problem of minority languages. I put here two pictures. This is traditional Breton clothing, and this is a pop group singing Breton songs in French language, mostly. And you see the clothing modernizes, and there is a language shift because these singers, they're very good, I like them. They are not native speakers of Breton. When they sing in Breton, sometimes they have a heavy French accent. So this thrives very much on the love of Breton culture, but it has changed very much from what Breton culture used to be. The same is true also for mainstream culture. We are all wearing the same clothes. I don't wear Austrian traditional clothing. I never speak the dialect I used to speak when I was young, and so on. So there is no way out, I believe, for this development towards the larger languages. Of course, why do people may not like what I just said? Because languages mark their speaker's identity. This is a quotation from the Swan. These people have already formulated this very well. It is like a badge. If you can speak this language, this is proof of identity. But that is only one function of language. It's basically an inalienable proof, because even if I learn such a language, people will always find out I'm not a native speaker. There's also the communicative side. And on the communicative side, the more languages, the better is not better. It is worse. And that may simply explain why English is winning on all fronts and why national languages prevail. And so what should linguists do? Document the languages and the language use, and developing theories how language shift, language change, language abandonment actually function and why they do so. Yeah. So there are also problems when you revitalize or preserve languages, because languages actually exist here only in spoken way. And each time one observes a language, one also changes it, as everything in the world, of course. So it influences the languages, for instance, by standardization procedures. It may be somewhat annoying for people who do not speak the language but identify as members of the minority group. After all, there are papers with the title, "Can you be a Hakka without speaking Hakka," for instance? Because that is far-reaching the case nowadays, and these people do not want to get excluded or being forced to learn a language when they don't have the time or the ability to do so. So there are a number of problems if one attempts to influence this process very much. For instance, Breton language, which I know a little bit, people at the university created a standard Breton, they used it in radio and so on, and the speakers did not accept this variety, which they could barely understand. So these are problems which cannot be neglected when working on reviving linguistic resources. So this is called Neo-Breton, a new Breton language. It's not the same anymore. I remember vividly that my Breton teacher stood beside the radio and pointed out every mistake in his view that these Neo-Bretons were making. So he was very unhappy with this development. He would prefer the language to disappear rather than being changed into a kind of French. Yeah? So these are the conflict situations which may occur. So from a communicative viewpoint, we can say a minority language cannot serve as an acrolectal medium. To give an example, in Austria, people may be proud speakers of their dialect, but they wouldn't accept it on TV in the news report. So the languages are functionally separate. And in a basilectal form, so in the family, it would be odd to speak the standard language. It is good to speak the dialect or the minority language. So as long as you have this functional separation, it's fine. But if you standardize a small language, what you're doing is actually you create an acrolectal medium of that language. And that may not be helpful. So I tend to repeat myself slowly. National languages and global languages, they naturally take over more and more functional domains because they are established. They are codified. You can buy a textbook and a dictionary. You can look up words. You can use the internet in these languages. So it is infinitely more useful. And the small languages are very difficult to access for the non-speakers. So providing such resources, yeah, is fine. One can do it, but does it really help anybody? That's the problem. What else could I tell you? Yes, de Swan, a sociologist, which I've quoted here several times, he speaks, you see, from a very global level, and he created this world language system where he puts peripheral languages, all the non-national languages, then central languages, all those nationally maintained languages, supercentral languages, which are more important than others, and then one hypercentral language, which is English, covering all languages in the world now, many languages in the world. And as long as there is global economy, global exchange at universities and so on, of course, the hypercentral language will win. And the supercentral languages may be important, and the central languages will prevail. But the peripheral languages somehow lost their function. And I think that's the explanation why we are faced with this oft quoted extinction of languages today. You see, when you look at maps of minorities, you find them at the fringes of a country. This is Germany. So here people speak Sorbian, and here they speak Frisian, and here they speak kind of Danish. So why are they at the margins? They're far away from economic centers here. So where economy and culture is departing from, this is the place where everybody speaks the standard language. And where do small languages prevail? In the hills, far away from economic centers and so on. So if speakers of minority languages want to succeed economically and educationally, what are they doing? They go to the capital, they learn the standard language. So this as an explanation why the small languages are in a very weakened position today. At the same time, something else happens. This is a language map of Germany, and the darker the blue, the more Turkish people live there. There are millions of Turkish speakers in Germany, and many of them maintain Turkish. Why do they do that? Because they identify as Turkish and they speak a lot with other Turkish people. At the same time, it's not that simple, because many Turkish nationals are actually Kurdish speakers. And then many people are, of course, weak in the Turkish and they speak German, but they develop their own ethnolect, an ethnic variety of German, so that you can still recognize that they are Turks. And this is the new situation of superdiversity, where language is not bound to a particular place. It is all over the place. It is more frequent in industrial zones where these people are working. And it is much less used in very rural areas with agriculture. So the linguistic landscape actually changes very much in the last few decades. And while we are speaking about autochthonous minorities, which are barely maintaining their languages, millions of speakers of other languages keep coming to other countries and create a completely new situation. But these languages, as so often in history, they come because of the high mobility of people and economic interests, and the languages may vanish as quickly within 2-3 generations, because as long as people adapt to the local national language, or maybe everybody shifts over to the hypercentral English. Who knows? So this might be the scenario for the future if things remain as they are today. And then in this case, I would say traditional minority languages and also urban minority languages may not stand a chance. Since we still have a little bit of time, maybe we can discuss the example of Singapore. You see very quickly after its foundation, the Chinese became a majority. By Chinese, I mean all speakers of Hokkien, Hakka, Cantonese, whatever. The Malays, at that time, there were few people, were first the majority, but they are now a minority. And the Indians kept their numbers quite stable over time. So this is the ethnic situation in Singapore. What happened to the languages? In 1957, only 2% of English speakers, now 32%. Nobody knew Mandarin, now 36%. And the Chinese vernaculars, they were used in 1957, but they are much less used today. So Cantonese, Hakka, Hokkien. Tamil was more stable, but also lost speakers, and Malay slightly lost speakers to English. So this is exactly what we were speaking about. English is just dominant. It doesn't do that. There is nobody behind that, but it is simply a matter of communicative usefulness. Of course, there were language policies in Singapore, speak good English, speak Mandarin campaign, but the people accepted it. There was some protest, I'm aware of that, for the emotional value of Singaporean English, for example, but people readily gave up Hakka language, for example, as we could hear in interviews. So we see that Singapore is practically a prime example of how English becomes more and more important here among the Chinese, among the Malays, among the Indians, and other central languages are also going strong, but the non-standard languages are going down. So that's what's happening. The Swan gave this Q value, which I can send you, or you can read in his book. I won't describe this now in detail. The communicative value of a language, and the more speakers there are you can potentially speak to, will give you a higher number between 0 and 1. And of course, if you learn English, you get a high number. And if you learn, let's say, Breton, you don't add very much to that number because there are not many speakers of that language. So this is a kind of quantification of the global linguistic problem. Of course, yeah. Maybe I won't go into all further details that I collected here. We have spoken about that already. Maybe you want to discuss with me, then we might do so now. Do you have any comments or questions or whatever it is to what I said? Just speak up. Don't worry. or tell me about your linguistic interest or work. Yes, I have asked for comments, questions.
Okay. Thank you for your sharing your knowledge. Anyone has comment or question? You can ask or just raise your hand.
Let's discuss. Maybe I said a few things which I often not mentioned in linguistics, the sociologist's viewpoint. But that's good to discuss. Are any of you work? Yes, please speak.
Singaporean English or Indian English or in English, yes. Okay, Singaporean English. Try to standardize Singaporean English or Indian English. They try to
Could
standardize
you repeat?
Singaporean English.
I'm not sure I understood. Sorry.
In world English, yes, right?
Indian English in India.
In India, people try to standardize Indian English or not, or in Singaporean English.
You're asking whether Indian English.
Sorry, please explain again your question.
Can you in Thai? No. Okay.
เดี๋ยวแชมป์ลองพูดภาษาไทยดูนะครับอาจารย์คืออย่างแบบในแบบ Singaporean English แบบนี้ครับอาจารย์มันมีการแบบ standardize ไหมเหมือนแบบ standardize English อะไรอย่างเงี้ยครับ
ไม่อยู่อินเดียเหรอคะ
ใช่ครับเหมือนใน Singaporean English แบบเนี้ยมันมีการ standardize ไหมใน English ต่างๆเนี่ยครับ
English ในประเทศต่างๆเหรอคะ
ใช่ครับมันมีการ standardize ไหมหรือว่าเขาแบบไม่ต้องการจะ standardize มัน
his question is any country they use English is need to be standardized or no need how to describe the standardized
Okay. English is standardized in England and the USA and Australia. That's the inner circle. Then there is an extended circle. For instance, in India, English probably is taken care of by the state. Yeah. And in Singapore is an English-speaking country. And on the other hand, Malaysia does not, or at least in the past, did not maintain English. It is not officially an English-speaking country. On the other hand, everybody knows English. But when there is no standardization, then you get Malaysian English or Singaporean English, which is not exactly the standard English, but is, some people called it a semi-Creole, half Creole, because it got influenced. You know, the people didn't learn English well, like at school, but they just spoke English with words, but with Chinese grammar. Malay grammar. Yeah? And so in this case, it's not standardized, but that's another interesting case. Now, the people know already a lot from English, and with more education, they will return to standard English, because the standard language, of course, that is something made objective. This does exist in a book. Whereas spoken languages, they totally depend on the speakers themselves. Let me mention another example, Tok Pisin. That is Creole of English, is the national language of Papua New Guinea. And more people speak this language because they have, hundreds of languages. So it is best if they can communicate in one language. And so Tok Pisin is very successful. Tok Pisin is a Creole, so it diverged very much from English. But the more people are educated, the more know standard English, and then Tok Pisin becomes more similar to English again. I give you one example. In Tok Pisin, to say west, orientation west, they say sunny go down. That means west, where the sun goes down. Yeah, sunny go down. But now younger people, they say west. And so Tok Pisin, even that is a separate language, but now it becomes roofed over by English again. No? This is what might happen. I hope I answered somehow what you were asking. Thank you for the question. I would be happy to discuss with you, with the others.
ไม่รู้ตอบคำถามไหมคะอาจารย์ดำรง เท่าที่พี่เข้าใจ
Okay, thank you. You answered.
Yeah, good enough.
เสียงดังนิดนึงอะค่ะ มันเสียงค่อย
Okay, thank you for your good answer.
Thank you.
So you mean in global level, the English, the standardized English is just England, Australia, and USA.
Yeah,
Something like that.
Yeah, this inner circle language, yeah. They cannot, I mean, as long as there is a global economy and we all interchange all the time, English will prevail. If this breaks down, then of course in Australia you will have a separate language after a while, because if there's no contact, how would that be maintained? Huh? And in the beginning I said, languages change, language use and languages change all the time. So I wouldn't be too concerned if we hear many languages today, people say die out and so on. They don't die. They are just no longer learned. It's not killing and murdering and dying. It is just, and it's normal. We don't know anything about the languages before the Romans and so on. Yeah? So now, if this goes on, maybe one day the whole world speaks only English, possible, but then it will become diverse again after a while. So that's how it is. That's what I'm saying. I don't argue for English, I'm just describing what's happening. And I point out, I'm happy that I can be here in Thailand, and I cannot be here for speaking German or whatever, but for speaking English. That's how I can be here. Well, are the other listeners all students, or? I left time for discussion. Maybe you can just tell me what you are working on. Are you working on minority languages? What are you doing?
Yeah, please share or any
Don't be shy.
the your work or your interesting research.
Yes.
สวัสดีค่ะอาจารย์
Hello.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I'm so sorry that I didn't I'm not be able to stay at the very beginning because I just came in towards the middle of your talk. So like I just would like to introduce myself. My name is Pathama Patpong. My nickname is Jo. I am a lecturer at Leoga, the same department as Silipen. And I'm very pleased to meet you and then to learn more for tomorrow also. But to introduce myself to you, I'm interested in syntax and discourse analysis. My research work is on minority languages, minority language, Black Thai, indigenous people, and what my research topic was on ritual. I work with Black Thai people collecting like a ritual and data that I'm interested in. It is like a manuscript because Black Thai people have got like a many rituals. Two main rituals. One is the worship, ancestor worship, and the other one is like a death ritual. So my research data, they were on like a manuscript, and then I look at the text and then trying to understand like a clause by clause what's going on. For example, for like a Black Thai people, the red ritual, death ritual, the master have to lead the soul go back to their original hometown. That is Vietnamese in Vietnam at Dien Bien Phu. So this my research interest. Another research interest, I'm interested in not minority languages, but in like Thai social media on depression. So I collected the data from social media and trying to like detect words or phrases or language pattern that like a depressed person used in order to express their feeling. So these are two my area of interest. Thank you so much for your talk and lovely to see you.
Well, thank you for this explanation. Very interesting. Yes, ritual and language. I have thought about that some time ago. That is a kind of literate style in spoken only languages. Yeah. Where language is used. Maybe that's interesting. There are very few papers about semiotics of magic, because speaking words and then things happen.
Yep, you're right. Because the language that they use, it seems like they
language.
talk to the spirit.
Switch on microphone.
Oh, okay. It seems like they talk to the spirit, not the living person, because in the ritual the master has to talk with the soul in order to make sure that the soul has been treated properly when they died. Yeah, spiritual language.
Yes. Can you compare this to some degree to Buddhist practices? I'm thinking now of mantra use.
Okay. I
But
haven't
all
thought.
kinds of rituals where you ask the Buddhas to
yeah, I haven't compared.
convey.
No. Yeah, that is a good
This
like
is
a suggestion. Yeah.
religious language use. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I don't have time for that, but yeah, I like it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for your thought. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
very interesting. And I didn't now comment on social media research. That's also.
Morning.
Um,
สวัสดีค่ะ
thank you. Hello.
So I am a PhD student. My name is Bim. I'm working on I'm working with the minority language and language documentation, and I'm interested in the phonological changes phenomena in, if I remember correctly, Austrian German, like in your slides, and I have seen like this phenomenon in much smaller languages. So I'm curious if that phenomenon does happen in the very particular like social situations or just like very definite occurrences.
Oh, please repeat the question now. Again, just the question and most of what you said.
I'm curious that if the
Microphone.
phonological changes occurrence, if it happens in definite like occurrence, can you hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry. Now I cannot hear you. You must switch on your microphone.
So, okay, so I have seen the phonological changes in much smaller like languages, and like I'm just surprised that I saw this in like a bigger languages. So I'm curious that if this occurrence just happen in like very particular situation, like informal conversation, or just like definite like occurrences, like in younger speakers, right?
Actually, it happens all the time. And I use this as an example how a dialect basically breaks down and becomes part of the standard language. And just by using some of these variations are free, but some may express a socio-pragmatic meaning. You know, your feelings, your attitudes, and so on. And maybe it works, maybe not. You can think of that. You can create a phonological list and also a word list sometimes, where particular words are pronounced differently, and then you can look in your transcript, when do they use it? And then, of course, you have to interpret whether this has a pragmatic meaning, that people switch to this or that word or this or that phonological. So, for instance, when somebody uses this, that is dialect, this is standard. So if they use this in a very formal setting, that might shed a bad light on the speaker. But when they use this form in a very familiar situation, you know, while drinking beer with friends, that also sounds odd. So, but not all are the same. For instance, this one here is very acceptable. So you can use the dialect form in standard language. It doesn't do so much harm. But when or this one is not bad, that's okay. But if you use this instead of that in a formal situation, then you sound like a peasant. You know, so that's what we did for Austrian German, and this is very intricate system, and it is not accidental what people are using. And I was thinking about it for Hakka language, but I didn't succeed so far. You see that you get different ways of saying exactly the same sentence in the same country, and it has a slightly different feeling. None of this is wrong, but you would choose on different occasions. Yeah. Maybe you find such a thing in your language that is interesting. I mean, register variation might exist in a language.
Yeah, in Thai, like we have a lot of slangs or like way of pronunciation that we use in different like occasions, but it does not like I mean express the different classes, I think. Yeah, it's just like very informal situation, like we write text in like Twitter or Facebook. We will not use like in like formal languages that much. Yeah, but I don't think it can like classify the classes like in this example that you show us. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. You know, when you write in, let's say, in WhatsApp to your friends, that is what I call an orate usage, but in writing. So in this case, for example, in this situation, minority speakers would like to use the minority language because it's a familiar style. Yeah. And so it is not writing versus speaking, but it is orate versus literate. And sure, you have such stylistic variation, for instance, certainly in Thai, maybe in inside of a minority language, or maybe between a minority language and a standard language. Yeah. This you have to figure out for your data, but that's interesting. And I'm not sure whether this applies to Asian languages that much, but this works well with, you know, similar things have been done for English in America and European languages, English in United Kingdom, and we did this for Austrian German. In Asia is a little bit different between the tone, because the tone languages, they don't rely so much on such segmental changes. I didn't succeed with that. I wanted to use that for Hakka. So far, I have not succeeded.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any of the listeners, if you want literature or any such comments, we can you can send me an email or something. Just maybe ask Siri Pen. I cannot write here on this computer. Ask Siri Pen for my address. We can talk. No problem.
Okay, anyone has anyone would like to share more or any question? Okay, if not, Professor Rab will conclude a little bit before we leave.
Yes, okay. So what did I actually say today? Wait a moment. Yeah, maybe I don't even look at my conclusions. So I introduced by saying, you know, in olden times, let's say hunter-gatherers, every group has their own language. Maybe they need to communicate, so they may learn each other's language. With the advent of big states, or what we called empires, you need usually some lingua franca, and also you need a written language in order to organize this state. And in the beginning, these written languages are very different from all spoken languages, and thereby they do not affect the smaller languages very much. And once society develops further, more and more people want to use the written linguistic resources, but they cannot learn a classical language. That takes too much effort. So sooner or later, people will prefer to get a demotized version of this book, of the standard language. And they will develop this until the national language, and we spoke about global English. And this now, of course, has a devastating effect on small languages, because basically one does no longer really need them if one connects to the international or national culture very much. Yeah? And that's why small languages survive in remote areas when people have a very distinct culture, but the moment they connect to the main culture, they may abandon their small languages. And I mentioned very radical positions of language maintenance, which I dislike because I don't like this aggressive tone in a fight for some justice or something, because there is no injustice. There's just a linguistic development which goes from small languages to large languages when the society is thriving, when the economy is good, when global economy is happening. Then people need to learn, in the extreme case, need to learn English. That's most important. No? And I think this is a simple explanation why we see everywhere today that small languages are endangered. And so what can we do as linguists? I don't feel like saving them. I feel like observing, describing, and understanding what is happening, how human beings use language. And I don't feel the need to preserve one particular language. But that doesn't mean I'm against them. I am very, very happy to see other languages, especially the small ones. This is exciting for a linguist, but for a sociologist, for somebody who is not particularly interested in languages, you can see they are much less emotional about that point. No? They just say, yeah, it's not useful. And this is a point I brought in here because I feel like this is not discussed very often in linguistics. The communicative value of languages. Yeah. So I conclude with that. That is a summary of what I said, I hope. Thank you for listening. Tomorrow I will be less theoretical, I believe.
โอเคค่ะจ้อเชิญค่ะ
No, I have got nothing to say. I just would like to say thank you to Professor Lav for your insightful talk, and then you have shared so many experiences of many different languages. I am amazed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I chose a little bit European languages because I think that is more difficult for you to access.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone, and I'm sincere to say thank you to Professor Ralph Roman, and we will continue tomorrow morning at the same time in the topic of the linguistics landscape of Malaysia. Okay, thank you. Bye bye.